Hello, everyone, and welcome to this Group of 78 webinar on the possibilities for a peace settlement in Ukraine. Our discussion today could not be taking place at a time more fraught with danger. Tensions are escalating rapidly, not only between Russia and Ukraine, but also between Russia and the NATO alliance. The recent referenda, Russia's annexation of and Ukraine's military incursions into the Donbas territories, and the specter of deployment of nuclear weapons all point to the extreme peril posed by the conflict for Russia, for Ukraine, and indeed for the entire world. We are now at a point where the alternative to a diplomatic solution to the conflict is unthinkable. The urgent question is no longer whether, but how a diplomatic resolution can be reached. Addressing this question is unfortunately not made much easier simply because the alternative is unthinkable. It calls for bold concessions by all sides that are bound to be controversial and likely to generate some pushback. It calls, in other words, for the exercise of consummate diplomatic skills and political leadership. I just might say parenthetically that many of these comments might apply to rising tensions over Taiwan. However, in this webinar, we're focusing on the problem of Ukraine, the Ukrainian conflict. To help illuminate the pathways to peace in this conflict, we are honored to be joined by Ernie Regehr, one of Canada's most distinguished scholars and practitioners in peacebuilding. Ernie will be introduced momentarily by John Foster, who is our distinguished moderator. John Foster held positions at the World Bank, Inter-American Development Bank, BP, and Petro-Canada. He's a member of the Group of 78's Board of Directors and lives in Kingston, Ontario. Just before the Russian invasion of Ukraine, the G78 published an essay entitled Peace in the Crosshairs, NATO Expansion Collides with Russian Security, in which John traces the course of events over the past 3 decades leading to the present war. John, over to you to make some introductory remarks and introduce our guest speaker. John, you're muted.
I was muted. I didn't realize I was being muted, so forgive me. So anyhow, thank you very much, Roy, and thanks for inviting me to offer some opening remarks. I promise you I'll keep them short and sweet. So I know war from personal experience, not as acute as some, but I was a child during the London Blitz, and I was in a landing craft, my naval days, during the 1956 Suez Crisis. What on earth was I doing there? I dislike war intensely. So the war in Ukraine is highly emotional, in a way that, say, Yemen is not. Ukraine's in our newspapers, and I would say that Yemen is hardly there. And I see 3 Ukraine wars going on at once, military, informational, and economic. So my first thought then is that this military war began, of course, when Russia entered Ukraine on February 24, but preparations began in the West in 2014, at that time of that forcible change of government, and even before. So the West claims not to be at war with Russia, but sending weapons to Ukraine has only intensified the war. And the recent sabotage of the Nord Stream pipelines has expanded the military war beyond the borders of Ukraine. Now, Washington, with that, continues its plans to weaken Russia, bring about regime change. And I still haven't seen it moving to wanting peace negotiations. Ernie will tell us about that. Some analysts even say that Washington wants to weaken Germany itself and Europe, its allies. That's as may be. My second thought is that we are subject to an enormous information war. And as they say, the first casualty of war is truth. Western control of the story has been highly successful. Just read the Globe and Mail every day. But what it does, it omits the reality of Ukraine's 8-year civil war between the Kiev government and the Russian-speaking Ukrainians. And it downplays Russian attempts last December to obtain security guarantees under the Helsinki Accords. And our media basically ignore many relevant facts. Here's my third thought, that the economic war also began in 2014 with sanctions against Russia. And Western sanctions have expanded enormously this year. There's the EU planning an 8th round. And they were meant to be a knockout blow against Russia. And they have emphatically not worked. And these Western sanctions have been ignored by the global South, a majority of the world's population. There were a number of countries in the global South badly affected. And the sanctions have backfired big time on Europe, causing a massive energy crisis and economic disaster of a kind, in my view, minimized in our media. But one thing for sure is that the United States has succeeded in breaking European trade with Russia, reversing almost overnight 60 years of cooperation. So what kind of a world do we want? Perpetual war and sanctions, or peace, cooperation, and diplomacy? There we are. I see 3 wars, military, informational, and economic, and a question of how can we end all 3? So with that, it's my great pleasure to introduce Ernie Regehr. He's a prominent Canadian, as Roy was saying, a respected voice on international disarmament and peace. You'll have read his bio when you registered, it was all there. And Ernie is a co-founder of Project Ploughshares and an officer of the Order of Canada. So we are all most eager to hear his talk on possibilities for a sustainable and just peace. Ernie, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much, John. Appreciate the introduction and also your introductory kind of context-setting comments. Thanks also to Roy and Sarah and the group of 78 for organizing this session and creating an opportunity, I think, that we need to collectively focus on prospects for and efforts towards ending this costly, high-risk war. I'm grateful for the invitation to introduce our session, although given the topic, as you've outlined it, both Roy and John, trepidation might be the more appropriate feeling to have at this point. But so my thanks do come with a caveat, namely, I didn't accept this assignment out of any sense that I possess expertise on Ukraine or special insight into the issues before us. I do share with many of you a commitment to peace building, and I have a long-term interest in how wars start and end. And I can add that my personal interest is heightened by the fact that in the mid-1920s, both of my parents fled the region just south of Zaporizhzhia, from villages what is now Molochansk in that area as refugees, and came to Canada as part of a significant migration that time. It's a family interest, family history that helps pique my interest, but unfortunately it doesn't really come with any special insights. Just before continuing, I should add that I have a bit of a post COVID cough. And so if I start hacking at some point, I hope you'll forgive me. I'll try to keep that short. The collective trauma of this war, the deaths and the many more injuries, the extraordinary physical destruction, the material and psychological, cultural, political costs, and the threats of escalation, including to nuclear use, all of these horrors properly trigger in us an alarm that says that this madness has to end and that talks must begin. But we also face the reality that has also already been referred to, that the conclusion we draw from our alarm is not reflective of the prevailing mood. For many, the greater fear is that a ceasefire could come too soon. Gwynne Dyer, a war analyst of unusual insight, I think, and well known to us all, recently noted that the risk of an early Russia-declared ceasefire has subsided in the face of dramatic Ukrainian gains on the battlefield. A unilateral Russian ceasefire, he pointed out, would have put enormous pressure on Ukraine to enter into negotiations at a deep disadvantage, reduced to salvaging what it could, while Russia remained in control of significant Ukrainian territory. Whether annexed or not, the territory under each party's military control at the time of a ceasefire promises to be hugely consequential, which also helps to explain Putin's offer of talks immediately following his annexation declaration. There is a prominent public mood, therefore, that figures Ukraine's struggles against the invader are likely to be more effective on the battlefield than at the negotiating table. The prevailing posture in our part of the world is oriented towards solidarity with Ukraine, including, of course, the shipment of major arms into the theater of conflict, with even the Oslo Research Institute, Oslo, very venerable Peace Research Institute, arguing for a significant increase in arms supplies to Ukraine so as to hasten the inevitable Russian retreat. Well, I think what's left out of that analysis is the ugly fact that such wars don't produce a winner, only mutually devastating exhaustion, with mop-up operations then left to the humanitarians and the diplomats searching for remnants of peace in a wasteland that war leaves in its wake. To his credit, Turkey's Erdogan conveyed that simple truth to the UN in his September 2022 address. The war, he said, will never have a triumph. He also added that a fair peace process would not have a loser. The latter claim is an article of faith, but it too is essentially true, I think, even if not always literally so, for even fair peace processes entail difficult compromises and painful losses are endured. But if a process is fair, the tough choices are freely made by the parties, even though they may well come to feel that they have no good choices available. Even if ceasefire proposals aren't currently of much interest to the parties of the conflict, there are still regular calls to end the fighting, especially from civil society groups. A recent Quincy Institute poll even suggests that 57% of U.S. voters would support the pursuit of negotiations to end the war. Ceasefire calls typically include three basic components in addition to the ceasefire itself. First, there are measures toward demilitarizing the conflict zone. Second, proposals to address governance challenges at the root of the discord in eastern Ukraine. And third, ideas for addressing Ukraine's unique position on the strategic fault line between Russia and the West. There are some important exceptions to this pattern. China's welcome call for a ceasefire following Putin's announced mobilization is significant, but includes no details and simply calls on the parties concerned to achieve a ceasefire and an end to the war through dialogue and negotiation. Similarly, a comment from Indian Prime Minister in the same context simply told Mr. Putin that this is not the time for war. But the three themes that I was just referring to that come up in Ukraine ceasefire and negotiation proposals are critically important. I'm going to spend a little bit of time on them because the key thing that we have to understand, I think, about negotiations is that they are not simply what we turn to when military efforts falter. Whatever the military outcome, negotiations will be key to any settlement, and especially to addressing the fundamental conflict still at play. If all Russian troops were soon expelled or fled from the Ukraine, there would still be the central issue related to threatening military postures on the border. The status of contested regions of Ukraine would still have to be clarified, and Ukraine would still have to figure out how to live beside a powerful neighbor. So here is a brief sampling of proposals that do include details. First, the demilitarization element. The current proposal being circulated on behalf of Richard Falk calls for a ceasefire to be accompanied by the phased withdrawal of Russian forces, and notably an end to the provision of lethal military aid to Ukraine. The ceasefire at the center of the Minsk proposals included provisions for international monitoring, some of which took place, as well as demilitarization measures, such as the withdrawal of foreign forces and a pullback of heavy weapons from the front line. The Rideau Institute ceasefire blog recently referred to Michael Clare's analysis, which sees a ceasefire accompanied by the return of Russian forces to pre-invasion positions. In addition, it calls for gradual demilitarization of the Donbass region guided by international peacekeepers. The second main element of such proposals typically addresses Ukraine governance issues. The Falk proposal simply refers to jurisdictional issues, notably for Crimea and the Donbass region, and the need to heal regional, ethnic, and religious animosities, and you can be sure those will be major challenges. The key Minsk provisions include the restoration of Ukraine's international boundary with Russia in honor of sovereignty and territorial integrity, as well as the promise of Ukrainian federalization and constitutional reform towards decentralization, specifically regarding some form of autonomy for self-government for Donetsk and Luhansk. The Clare proposal similarly calls for referendums in relevant regions of Ukraine to determine their preferred political status. These governance issues are key to the long-term stability of Ukraine on two levels. First, as I said, even if all Russian troops vacated Crimea, the Donbass, and other occupied territories, the issue of the ultimate status and governance of those regions would still be a problem to solve. Future stability would still depend on the people of those regions having a genuine choice, and on Kyiv managing a national government that is respected and has the confidence of the regions, a sense that their interests would be served if they cast their lot with Ukraine. The second way in which national governance is key is for defense, protection against foreign interference, States that build a national consensus, national institutions that are supported and trusted across the entire population are much less vulnerable to interference and ultimately to attack. In the absence of a national consensus, mistrust leads to unrest, which in turn invites intervention. Look at the examples of Afghanistan, Iraq, Ukraine, Libya, Serbia, and so on. The third point, attention to strategic stability, is is also an element of most ceasefire proposals. Of course, strategic stability questions have long been a prominent feature of the Ukraine conflict, with neutrality a widely proposed solution. The Folk letter thus proposes neutrality for Ukraine. The Minsk process was built on the assumption that if the interests of the constituencies more oriented to links to Russia would be better taken into account in an effectively governed Ukraine, the result would be genuine accommodation expressed through non-alignment. The Clare paper responds to the strategic stability element by proposing the familiar Ukrainian pledge to stay out of NATO. Tatiana Stanovaya, who is a scholar with the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, makes a very strong case that regional stability and a peaceful Ukraine depends substantially on Western and Ukrainian respect for Russian security interests. He argues, as have many others, that the West has been ignoring Russian geopolitical concerns for 30 years, that if Russian concerns are chronically ignored, it will continue to have both the means and the willingness to exact a price. Solidarity with Ukraine can reinforce an unrealistic expectation that the security concerns of Russia can be ignored by Ukraine with impunity. U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken has spoken regularly of the sovereign right of the Ukrainian people to write their own future. It's a legitimate principle. But writing a national future can't ignore the dynamics of the neighborhood in which that is to happen. Geographic, political, and strategic contexts have a way of imposing limits on national options. Canada, for example, must certainly have due regard for how its powerful neighbor might react to Canadian security policy. We have a long history of defense against help in this country. Ukraine is no less in the shadow of a powerful neighbor, and even after the present war ends, Ukraine will still have to take into account the interests and preferences of its powerful, not to mention paranoid neighbor. That obviously can't mean that Canadian security policy simply gets written in Washington, or that Ukraine simply acquiesces to the dictates of Moscow. It does, however, mean that in both cases, the key to recognizing the security interests of a powerful neighbor while still charting a reasonably independent path is intensified diplomacy in pursuit of mutually acceptable security arrangements. So in short, credible ceasefire proposals must point to mechanisms designed to move toward demilitarizing the conflict zone, give attention to the effective domestic governance related to internal discord, and offer measures to restore East-West relations that acknowledge mutual security interests in support of strategic instability, or in support of strategic stability. But the mechanism that is missing is the one that will actually get us to a ceasefire in the first place. While there are prominent, high-profile ceasefire overtures immediately before and after the February 24th invasion, by midsummer, communications between the two sides was practically non-existent, with mutual charges that there was no desire to discuss anything in earnest. Ukraine has explored peace initiatives. Indeed, there have been persistent claims that its early peace overtures were deliberately quashed by Western interests. Past proposals by Ukraine have emphasized security guarantees, non-alignment, future negotiations on the status of Crimea, more immediate governance measures related to Donetsk and Luhansk. But by Mr. Zelensky's September 21 speech to the UN, such ideas had been rejected in favor of a 5-point peace formula that was a set very maximalist conditions. Punishment was the first one, including sanctions, special tribunal on war crimes, reparations. Protection of life was how he characterized the second one, and that referred to defense and the continuing requirements for weapon supplies and financial support. The third was restored security and territorial integrity, now including as a precondition Crimea. Security guarantees were the fourth, and that now reject neutrality. And finally, a determination to keep fighting. The analyst Anatol Levin points out that Ukraine's negotiating capacity is constrained by its understandable anger at the Russian invasion and Russian atrocities in particular, by pressure from Ukrainian hardliners, especially in the military, and increasingly by the government's own rhetoric, which is committing Ukraine to goals like the recovery of Crimea that could only be achieved by total military victory over Russia. Of course, there is a sense in which Zelensky is not asking for anything beyond the normal rights of a sovereign state. But most observers, including Levin, continue to assume that when a ceasefire finally comes, it is likely that Russia will still occupy parts of Ukraine, and so a compromise will be in order. That means the key challenge is to ensure that a ceasefire is not a de facto acquiescence to territorial conquest. A ceasefire that freezes the conflict in order to stop destruction and pave the way for talks must come without implied territorial concessions and with an international commitment to relentlessly pursue the return of territory or of a negotiated change that Ukrainians themselves endorse. Russia also has obviously opted for maximalist demands. In his September 21 speech, Mr. Putin, without any apparent trace of irony, vowed to fight for the territorial integrity of Russia, in which he now, of course, includes the four claimed regions of southeast Ukraine, as well as Crimea. He famously promised Russia would use all the means at its disposal, assuring us that he was not bluffing. While Mr. Putin has tried out various rationales for his attack on Ukraine, protecting the spiritual center of the Holy Rus, or that Ukraine is not a real country, but the real objectives are likely to be more familiar, like seeking a reliable buffer zone between Russia and NATO and preventing Ukraine from being a spearhead for anti-Russian influences. Those maximalist demands are what ceasefire proposals are now up against. The prevailing view in the West has been that negotiations are up to Ukraine, but that is not a credible position for a collective West that is obviously not a passive bystander, but is in fact a major contributor to the fighting, and that with the rest of the world faces the grave dangers of continuing and escalating war. With activist engagement in and support for the war, and that includes Canada, come political and moral obligations to try to limit the devastation and sue for peace. But how? The Mexican president, Obrador, recently had an interesting, relevant idea that a commission for dialogue and peace be formed, and led by UN Secretary General Guterres, Pope Francis, and Indian Prime Minister Modi. Not all find Obrador an influential or persuasive intervener, but the idea is compelling because progress towards negotiations really do depend on there being an effective and continuously operating negotiating forum, one that stays actively engaged with representatives of the parties at whatever level of representation they are prepared to send at any given time, that regularly tests the parties' openness to negotiations and particular formulas, and that continuously develops and explores settlement options. Such a forum could, among its activities, maintain an inventory of credible negotiating ideas and proposals, available to the parties. So I leave that as my final point, John. Part of our discussion might usefully focus on proposing to the Government of Canada that its support for a just outcome and an early end to the devastation should include expending at least some material and political capital in support of a Ukraine ceasefire peace platform to promote early attention to the negotiations that will, in the end, be absolutely essential for ending the current crisis and especially for ensuring future stability. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ernie, for your stimulating comments and talk. And I would say that that's already stimulated three questions in front, four questions. Probably going to keep going as I speak. So here's a very, they're all related. Here's a very short one. I won't say who's given these questions unless Roy would like me to announce the who's proposing these questions. But here's the first one. Short and sweet. Does Russia and its regime have genuine security concerns other than from its own people?
Well, I think a short and sweet answer is yes. Any significant power has regional security concerns and interests. Is worried about what is on its border, and I think if you want to have stability in that region in which it resides, you're going to have to pay some attention to that. That doesn't mean total appeasement, obviously, but I think that there are genuine security concerns that Russia has for its territory. I mean, I agree with the implied element of that question, and that is that if Russia was a society that was much more responsive to the interests and needs of its people, some of those regional security concerns would fade away. But in the current context and in the foreseeable future, there are regional issues that the rest of the world needs to deal with Russia on.
Thank you so much. The second question goes like this. You mentioned referendums, or is it referenda, to determine the loyalties of the denizens of the war zones as part of the peace process. The problem is that there have been referendums, such as in Crimea and more recently in the Donbass, but these referendums are portrayed by Western media as illegitimate. How to ensure that this process is transparent?
Well, I think that central to this conflict has been the turmoil, unrest in southeastern Ukraine, and it's obviously for Ukrainians to sort that out. But the process by which it's sorted out needs to be credible for all parties involved. And so I think the referenda is the kind of automatic reference that we make. The assumption is that they need to be internationally monitored, and if Ukraine had other means by which they could test the preferences of that region in credible and trusted ways, then I think people would obviously be open to that. But there needs to be a trusted, internationally recognized, credible process by which the future of those regions are determined.
Great, thank you so much. Now, I think I just save that question up. Yes, two questions. Those are two questions in one. What role will war reparations play in peace discussions? I.e., if Russia says no to paying for any damage caused, what then? Second question, do the former Soviet-controlled Eastern European countries, Poland, the Baltic states and so forth, with their past histories with Soviet Union come Russia, have legitimate interests in these peace discussions?
I'd be interested in hearing the questioners also, express some views on that. I think it's inevitable that reparations be part of a conflict resolving set of negotiations and discussions, and it's very possible that Russia would say a blanket no, but I think it's also quite likely that if Russia wanted to have some relief from sanctions and reintegrate into an international trading relationships, John, you can speak more about this. But I think if there's those kinds of interests are there, then you can't just repeatedly keep saying no when there are legitimate claims on use. So reparations would clearly be part of the process, and I think that Russia, there are reasons why Russia would not find it wise to simply say no to them. And I think particularly in the third element that I spoke about, in the strategic security element of ceasefire and negotiation, those obviously affect two things. One is the broad relationship between the West and Russia, and that clearly needs a total reinvention. There is such a thing as an Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, and that includes everyone. But there needs to be a way of developing mutual respect and mutual concern for or acknowledgement of the other's security interests. So that and Eastern Europe obviously would be part of that. And Ukraine being on this fault line between East and West has a particular challenge to find a way of straddling that fault line in a way that can be stable going forward into the future. And just picking one side over the other is probably not a formula for stability.
Thank you. Now, here's a humdinger coming up. There are a few people suggesting that the United States blew up the Nord Stream pipeline. If this is true, is there any hope of getting the US to be condemned by the international community and for justice to be served? There is no precedent for this, to my knowledge. The US seems to be untouchable and above the law. Comment.
Well, I'd welcome further comment on that. I mean, does anybody know what happened to that pipeline? I think that there's genuine speculation, and there are arguments to be made in various directions. I'm really not in much of a position to speculate on what the situation is. I think that the urgent thing, regardless of what happened there, the urgent thing in front of us is to get the international community to understand that this war cannot go on indefinitely. The risks are extraordinary, and the devastation is already extraordinary. So that we need to focus some attention on how we get off of this track that we're on. And I middle power states, I think the idea of the Pope and the UN Secretary General and India creating a table isn't the craziest idea, but I think that there needs to be an international forum or table created. And it can involve track two elements to it if the main parties are not willing to sit at a table yet. But I think that the table needs to be constructed, work needs to be done, and participation needs to be invited. And I think there will come a time when the parties to the conflict will see that that's a mechanism, a forum that we need to take advantage of. But it needs to be created, and it can be created now, even in a climate that is quite sharply wary of ceasefire and negotiations.
Roy has invited me to give one or two supplementary thoughts, if I could add to your what you were saying, relating to the pipeline itself. And that is that there are articles on the internet. I did one for Canadian Dimension on the pipeline explosion and the kind of the whodunit as to whether anybody at the end of that, which would require a proper investigative and impartial, independent investigation, which I don't think anybody's going to allow to delve into these explosions. That's another matter. But the circumstantial evidence, to my mind, does point not to Russia, who has no skin in the game. It partly owns these pipelines, and the other part is owned by Europeans to the extent of 50%, more or less. Major companies in Germany like Uniper, Anglo-Dutch Shell. But there's only 2 or 3 countries, I won't name them, who could possibly have had the access and the technological prowess to be able to carry this out. But I have this article in Canadian Dimension. There's a very good article by Thomas Pally that comes to my mind, which can be Googled and found. And if anybody wants me to let me know, and I can give the link for that. But to my mind, the blowing up of these pipelines extends the war outside Ukraine. It's a very serious step to take. It's an act of war. So I'll move on to the next question. I want to put very quickly. That's one, I will name who gave it. It was Doug Roach. Do you see a role for China as a mediator in the Ukraine-Russia crisis?
Well, thanks for that. I mentioned the welcome statement that China made, calling for a ceasefire and for negotiations, and for China to get involved in that, I think would be a very welcome thing. There may be China watchers there who see risks in that process, and I would defer to their concerns. But I think that that would be a very important contribution. In China could be persuaded to help create the kind of table I've been talking about. There's no country in the world that is entirely neutral on these things. I mean, everybody goes into negotiations and into a process from a certain context with certain preferences and so forth. So China isn't, by virtue of its relationship with the United States, disqualified any more than the United States is, or Canada or India are. So I think that I don't know the way in which China might be actively persuaded to be engaged, but the statement that it made, I think, was welcome and constructive. It was a signal to the Russians that you're not going to have unqualified support from us on the course of action that you've chosen. So I think that there's potential there for a constructive role by China.
Here's a quick question, or is it? Is this a conflict that the people of Russia really want, or is this Putin's war?
Well, that requires a response of people who follow Russia very closely. From my just observation and paying attention to the media, like we all do. I certainly think it's the latter. I mean, the evidence seems to be all around that this is a regime interest, not a public interest, that Putin is pursuing.
And I guess in the same vein of question, which I must say I would hesitate to know how to answer, is it reasonable to expect Ukraine to concede anything to the perpetrators of a Holodomor? Do I pronounce that rightly?
Well, it's important for Ukraine to pursue a course of action in the future in which it enjoys a measure of stability in the region in which it exists. You can't do that without making certain kinds of accommodations. I think the atrocities that have been committed by Russian forces are extraordinary, and in the moment are unforgivable. But in the long term, the geography of Ukraine is not going to change, and the strategic context is not going to change unless there's a major change in Moscow, which I wouldn't discount, but which you can't depend upon. So that there are certain realities that have to be faced and dealt with, and that's what's going to have to happen. I mean, if there are means by which International Criminal Court and those kinds of institutions become engaged in this, all to the good, of course.
Thank you so much. Gosh, the questions are coming in fast and furious. Would elections throughout Ukraine let citizens decide their representatives' language and priorities each oblast could have in a new federation? That assumes a federation, I guess. UN Stockholm election assistance ensure a fair election.
Yeah. Well, I think, absolutely that for the Ukraine to find a way in which its national direction can be determined and supported by a national consensus is absolutely important and essential. So that there are divisions that need to be worked at, and whether it's national elections, federation, referenda on the status of certain regions, these are all mechanisms that are available. But the objective is a unified Ukraine that has a governance system that is reflective of the population and wins the trust and support of that population. I think that's the objective, and that's something that our part of the world should be very interested in supporting and helping to fund when that becomes possible.
This question, well, first of all, it's an accolade to you. Thanks to Ernie Regehr for a masterful overview of the diplomatic challenges. A question, given the Helsinki Accords, the follow-up 1990 Paris Charter and creation of the OSCE to energize the search for strategic peace in Europe, affirmation of human rights and international cooperation in all spheres, is there a possible role for the OSCE, or does the world have to start again from scratch, as suggested by the President of Mexico?
I believe that there is a role for the OSCE. I believe that we need to be part of an effort that downgrades the role of defense alliances in establishing the strategic context for that whole region. NATO is not the institution by which regional stability is going to be achieved. I mean, I think that there are important reasons why East Europeans particularly feel very dependent upon NATO, and the Baltic countries in the present context want to have the support of major powers. I can understand all of that, but in the long run, their own security is tied to the stability of the region in which they reside, and the stability of the region within they reside is going to require a region-wide institution for doing that. I think there are myriad reasons why the OSCE hasn't lived up to the potential that I think it had, but I think it's that sort of an institution which is focused on pursuing mutual security arrangements rather than competitive security arrangements. That's going to be essential.
Thank you. Now, this question you've partly answered already, but whether you want to take it a bit further, as this question does. This is Putin's war. Can there be any deal while he is in power? I could supplement, or any of the Western leaders come to that.
Sorry, I was.
Wait till you're ready.
I was going through a little bit of a coughing. Would you mind just repeating that?
Yes,
and if you have comments on it, feel free.
This is Putin's war. That's a statement. Can there be any deal while he is still in power?
Well, I think we all agree that a deal is difficult, but I would certainly not say a sort of a clear, unqualified no to that question. That ultimately we're dealing with Russia, and Russia too has to find a way of living in the world in which it finds itself. Russia has in other parts of the world, in the Arctic in particular, has a very different set of interests that it needs to pursue, and that it wants to have a stable, friendly environment in that region in order to pursue its interests there. So there are myriad interests that Russia has. They're not all about Putin and Holy Mother Russia. There are other factors there, but I wouldn't want to be Pollyannish about it. I mean, that it'd be simple with Putin still in place is obviously not the case. But I think that we have to pursue a settlement with the Russia that is there, not one that we wished was there.
John?
Yeah, right.
Yeah, there's a question by Peggy Mason, which I think would be good to hear Ernie speak on.
We have 3 questions left at this point. They all look good to me. Do we have time for 3, do you think?
Yes, let's do the 3 and then we'll pack it in.
Fine, I'll reverse their order, I think, of delivery. So here's one for you. I would like to hear more on your, this is not me, who wrote it, on your last point that an ongoing international negotiating forum like that proposed by Mexico can be created. What steps can we call for to this end, and who might we engage to that end? Certainly Canada seems sadly to not be a possible prospect to push such an idea. Who else might credibly do this?
Yeah, I think it's a very good question, and I think it needs some research. I mean, Canada's position currently is doesn't seem to lend itself to that. I mean, if that came from Peggy, I would be interested in her elaboration and comments on it. But I think that that there are countries, some African countries. Well, I'll just sidetrack a little bit. The idea of an ongoing, regular forum, even when the parties themselves aren't that keen on it, and may only send, the janitor there or some, to a peace talk. It's very important. That was the case in a couple of conflicts in East Africa, particularly the Sudan, South Sudan war. I mean, there were ongoing talks going there, and when the parties weren't that interested into it. But the momentum built up, and there came a time when the parties found it useful to be associated with them. The same thing happened in northern Uganda and the Lord's Resistance Army in that area with some Canadian involvement ongoing forum. So I think that the principle is the development of an ongoing forum. There are respected states in Africa. You remember when the war first started, the ambassador to Kenya at the Security Council made quite an extraordinary speech about the importance of respecting sovereignty and so forth. So there are countries like that also have a kind of a hosting function that they could play. I'm just kind of talking off the top of my head now, but I think it's an idea that warrants serious attention and overtures to serious players to become a part of
it. Thank you. I have two final questions. Both of them I find absolutely fascinating. One is this. Given that the OSCE has confirmed that there were 14,000 plus people killed in Ukraine's eastern provinces between 2014 and 2022, would future discussions of reparations have to include indemnification for those losses? And given that the destruction wrought by the present fighting is all occurring in those same areas with strong NATO support, how can that suffering be expected to lead the Western alliance into, quote, reasonable negotiations, unquote?
Yeah. John, if you have ideas on this, feel free, or anyone else in the audience has some, feel free to talk about it. But I think that the point of negotiations is that really everything is on the table, and there need to be mechanisms of accountability. Although those are very, very difficult, and others will know much more about that than I do, to maintain when the primary interest becomes stopping the fighting and ending this element of the devastation. You don't want some of these other factors of reparations and so forth to prevent a basic agreement. But I think I just feel myself kind of swimming around here a bit. I mean, I think the point is that in negotiations, all of these things are up for discussion, need to be addressed, and parties involved need to find some ways of finding accommodation. I mean, I think these are things that an ongoing forum could tackle. These are questions that require expert testimony and so forth. So there's a lot of that kind of work that could be done by a forum and begin to raise these questions.
I have two more questions. One is very short at the end, but this one, and I would comment, by the way, too, that my understanding is that in the Russian occupied areas, that the Russians are themselves undertaking repair work, from what I read, Mariupol, for example, and that the Chinese too have offered, unless I'm mistaken, to do work in those areas. So we'll see. I think one of the problems is that the Western journalists don't go there to visit and have a look. They rely upon press releases given to them in Kiev. So we'll see how reliable they are. This question, Russia, meaning Yeltsin, signed the NATO-Russia Founding Act, agreeing in effect to NATO expansion without restriction. Does that matter now for how a peace agreement and ceasefire are accomplished, given the not 1 inch eastward assumption? Is Ukraine neutrality possible or just necessary in other words?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think the it definitely matters. It matters how NATO responded to that and the way in which it transformed and the East-West relationship at a time when there was a possibility for modeling a new kind of East-West relationship in those early years of the post-Cold War. It's one of the most tragic of and lamentable periods, I think, is that we squandered that opportunity. So it matters a lot. You can't turn the clock back there, but I think that you can still affirm that as representing a possibility that existed at one time and can be recovered. And I mean, that gets back to the role of the OSCE and so forth. And I just wanted to make one other point following on what you said, John, and that about the Western media not covering. I mean, I think it is extraordinary that we simply do not have the same kind of reporting of this war as we have had in other wars. I mean, we've all in the past decried the idea of journalists embedded with military forces and so forth, but those were still opportunities for journalists to go deep into areas of conflict and reflect back to us some of the things that are going on. Right now, I don't think we have a very good idea at all about what the nature of the fighting is in those contested areas. I mean, the relevant role of Russian forces, the relevant role of Ukrainian forces that are opposed to Kiev, the relevant relative role of Kiev forces. I think there's a lot of there that is opaque and that we don't understand fully the nature of the fighting and that is happening currently and who the contestants are.
I would say that I very much appreciate your comment there, and I have the feeling it even goes to atrocities that we don't know to what extent they have happened, or we're having our legs pulled because there is no independent investigation, and there's a heck of a information war going on. So two comments have come in, which really are statements. So I therefore say, let's not call them a question unless you wish to. They're from Peggy Mason, who's replying to in your response to one of your earlier answers to a question. To respond to Ernie, I think you have focused on the key point, the creation of an ongoing, credible international mechanism that has to be championed by as many of the voices calling for peace as possible. Overtures need to be made again to the UN Secretary General. Other possible names need to include, if not Modi, someone that Russia will see as not an enemy. And she continues in a second one. I'll hold on that because that's a question my final question I wanted to put to you from Doug Roach, who's saying we have an quote, ongoing forum, unquote, is called the United Nations. Can we make the UN work? And Peggy has a comment to that, so I'll throw it in and wrap it in to answer Doug. The UN as a whole cannot be the negotiating forum. We need a dedicated focus group that the Secretary General could lead if he would agree.
Yeah, I agree entirely with that. The UN has a key role to play, but I think in this Ukraine conflict, there is a need for a dedicated Ukraine-specific, Ukraine-Russia-specific platform to explore all of the issues that are going to have to be addressed for this, not only for this war to come to an end, but for there to be a stable region and stability for Ukraine and its neighbors going forward.
And Doug Roach has come back to say, I'm not ready to give up on the United Nations. A stronger Secretary General might come in the future. And another comment from somebody else saying, sure, elections could end the war. So those are the end of the questions. I haven't asked mine. I don't need to. There were so many of the other ones, and we've run over time. Roy, shall I continue with a saw off at that point on the questions?
Please do, yes.
So I want to give my thank you, very, very short and sweet this time, given the hour. But it's my great pleasure, Ernie, to thank you for your splendid talk, which was so thought-provoking, as you can tell from the questions, insightful and stimulating, a ray of hope. So, and thanks for answering all those questions as you have done so thoroughly. And we're enormously appreciative. Over to you, Roy.
Okay, it's up to me just to bring this fantastic session to an end. I'd like to say before we finish that, Ernie, I hope we can upload your text to our website so that others can peruse it at their leisure.
Sure.
Okay, that being the case, thank you, Ernie, and thank you, John, for your magnificent presentations and for your ability, with great humility, to enter into some very difficult territory. But these are very difficult issues that we're going to have to struggle with for some time to come. But I think I'm hopeful, given the amount of imagination that many people are starting to put into this challenge, and that's what it's going to need. Not only compromises and imagination, but also leadership by political leaders and people in civil society. So with those words, I'd like to thank all of our participants for their insightful questions and comments, and to Sarah Bowles, our Executive Secretary, who has backstopped and set up the webinar. Thanks to all. Take care and see you soon.